G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas, and few issues are as dangerous, as charged, as emotional as governments' responses to COVID. What happened during the pandemic? The lockdowns, the economic support, the failures, the successes. Uncomfortable Conversations as a show is not about manufacturing uncomfortable conversations in the studio where I make people uncomfortable or try to, coerce them into situations that aren't comfortable for them. Rather, the uncomfortable refers to the fact that we talk about topics that if you were to raise them at an office Christmas party or at a picnic or at a barbecue or at the pub or the bar, it would make people uncomfortable to hear someone speak stridently about these issues. So I try to tease them out in a sane and moderate and conciliatory way so that we can have those difficult conversations, those uncomfortable conversations, in perhaps quite comfortable ways. And within the subset of issues around COVID and government's responses thereto, I would say that Australia looms pretty large for a lot of people outside of Australia as either a lesson in what you should do or should not do during a pandemic. There's nothing that will get an American at Thanksgiving more riled up than mentioning Australia's pandemic lockdowns, and you will instantly tell what side of the political spectrum they are on by their subsequent line of questioning and their pronouncements on the issue. So today's guest has conducted one of the first major, complete, comprehensive economic and public health analyses of what happened in Australia, how it compares to performance in other countries. He is not a blind, Australian, yes man. He doesn't work for the Australian government. He is a former economist at the Australian Treasury, so he started out there, but he's now an assistant professor of economics at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And he comes at this as an economist. But not just as an economist with regard to what can make us the most money, but an economist with regard to how do you design policies to get the most out of human behavior, essentially. It's almost like the freakonomics of the pandemic. Actually, that's quite a good title. I think I'll call this episode The Freakonomics of the Pandemic, because he's really good at kind of, interrogating, well, if you did things like this, then how would that change people's behavior? And how much of people's behavior is a reaction to enforced lockdowns, and how much of it is a reaction to the fact that there's a pandemic swirling around? Anyway, he's currently a visiting fellow at the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute at the Australian National University. He's done a lot of research on the effect of taxes on human behavior in the interest of designing better tax policy. And as a result, during the pandemic, he was called upon a lot, both by governments, but more so actually by the media, as an expert about how the hell we should be handling this thing. He's published opinion pieces in the Washington Post. He was called upon by the New York Times, by Time Magazine, Newsweek, and The Atlantic. And he's now put all of his wisdom into a book that he's written with his colleague, Richard Holden. The book is called Australia's Pandemic Exceptionalism. Please enjoy as much as I did the one and only Stephen Hamilton. So, there's a lot to talk about. And you managed to cram it all into a surprisingly entertaining and interesting book, I got to say. I loved it.
Good to hear.
Shall we start with what we know about how well various countries did? How would one even measure such a thing?
I mean, look, there are many outcomes. I think the two that you would focus on, I think, are deaths per capita, right? How many people died as a result of COVID per person? Obviously, more people died in bigger countries. And the other one is, maybe you could say something like GDP per capita, right? So how much economic destruction was there? How much destruction of life was there?
Right. How much did it cost? How much did it kill?
Yeah. And I think people would have in their mind that these two things are kind of a trade-off, right? That if you want to save lives, you're going to give up something on the economy, right? Or if you want to go full on, let the economy be untouched, you're going to have to kill some people, right?
Let her rip.
And it didn't work like that at all, right? Australia had both among the highest GDP per capita performances and the fewest deaths. And so that's, one of the insights I think in our book is that this traditional focus on trade-offs just did not apply in COVID the way that we normally would think of it.
Right. And the reason, and I want to throw a third metric in there because you would also want to care about liberal democracy, human rights.
Yeah.
Right? Because
Sure.
Yeah, presumably you could get the GDP up and the health statistics up by literally imprisoning.
Yeah, you can weld doors shut.
Yeah, you could weld everyone inside,
Which happened.
right? Which happened in China.
Richard, my co-author, wrote in the book, we could literally have welded doors shut. And I said to him, can you just check that actually happened?
Right.
He's like, yeah.
And it did. Yeah. They literally did. So you could have gotten both metrics up by pouring.
Of course. The issue's multifaceted. We can talk about lots of different things, but we should also not imagine on the liberal democracy part, on the freedom part, that letting COVID rip with all of its consequences would ensure people had freedom. Because
yes. So this is what I was about to say as well. So the reason why there isn't the traditional conflict that people think is because human beings are not automatons who go about their daily lives regardless of the conditions around them.
Exactly.
When they're at risk of getting really sick for a couple of weeks and maybe ending up in hospital and maybe killing their elderly aunt, they modify their behavior, and that behavior modification of not going out to the pub when it might get you really, really, really crook means that you don't spend money on beers, and that means the economy goes into a massive recession.
So
either way.
There's good evidence from the US that we cite in the book that there was this self-lockdown phenomenon, that the mere existence of COVID extrapolating from government lockdowns, where there was big reductions in economic activity, even if the government didn't restrict activity, and because people chose not to.
In fact, one of the most interesting, the book is packed with interesting anecdotes and data points where, if you're a bit of a nerd, you'll find them fascinating. One of them is that there was a study of areas of the United States that intersected with a bunch of states.
Exactly.
Where there were different lockdown rules in each state. So you might be at a quadrant of like where 4 states intersect and people commute to work across them.
Yes.
And they tried to unpick what the variables were in order to establish how much of the reduction in movement is taking place because of rules, and how much of the reduction of movement is taking place because people are choosing not to move around and socialize anyway.
Because you have these rules that are sharply different.
That are sharply defined, across a single suburb or neighborhood in some cases, if there are cities that are sitting on the boundary of states. And they found it was something like 17% or something, or 7%. Or, it was less than a fifth of the change.
The majority was due to self-lockdown.
Vast majority was self-initiated.
And you can look at those states, but you can also just look at Sweden, right? So Sweden is the poster child of the let it rip strategy. Now, they didn't let it rip, but they were much more liberal, and they had significantly worse economic and public health performance than Australia. So again,
and than their neighbours.
They
certainly had worse health outcomes. They had more deaths than their neighbours. Right?
Yes, definitely. So and then we get into a tricky situation where you ask, how many deaths are we willing to tolerate? What are we willing to do in that space, right? And I'd acknowledge that we shouldn't deny that there are any trade-offs, right? We shouldn't deny that there aren't costs, right? I mean, at the end of the day.
But weren't you just denying that there are costs? Basically saying it's a false dichotomy to choose between do we make the economy good or do we improve lives?
Here's the way we explain it in the book. The first thing is to say we have a virus. It's spreading exponentially. And we have a pretty good idea of its sort of lethality. We kind of have a reasonable sense of how many people it's going to kill, right? And it's a virus. And so if it's left to its own devices, it will spread exponentially, right? And that will lead to certain outcomes. Now, if we can take action, if we know that eventually people are going to take actions themselves, they're going to do self-lockdown, that's going to harm the economy. That's, eventually the curve is going to bend, right? Which it does.
What curve?
Like the case curve, right? So you look at if you don't put in measures, it's not like the virus goes to infinity, right? Eventually.
Doesn't everyone eventually just get it?
No, it kind of, we get a standard curve that kind of bends. Now the question is.
I mean, haven't we all had it at this point?
But in a wave, in a
I
single
see what you're
wave.
saying, in the single sort of cataclysmic.
Yeah.
So
and
the
so
first, right, okay.
You'll get
ups
outbreaks,
and downs,
right? And I would say Or you can earlier on take actions to kind of bend the curve, or in our case, this is kind of what the subtitle of the book is, crush the curve, to kind of avert that situation. And you have to ask yourself, what do you gain from doing that, right? And so the way we thought of it in Australia, and I think it was the right way, is we're going to keep spread through measures so that the virus will not spin out of control. Okay, so we're going to make sure that that's the thing we don't give up on. We're going to keep what we call R, the reproduction rate below 1. And then the question is, okay, given we're going to do that, we're not going to let the thing spin out of control. How are we going to achieve that?
Right.
And in that space of R less than 1, we've got lots of choices.
I see.
So
then that's where the trade-offs kick in.
I think so.
But the trade-offs don't kick in because what you're saying is that if R is more than 1, and people will remember R, I think. We probably haven't talked about it in a few years, but in 2020, everyone was learning suddenly about R, right? The R1 or the whatever.
Yeah.
An R above 1 means that the average person is transmitting the virus to more than one person. So it's going above its reproductive rate. And anyone who's studied, how compound interest works or exponential curves knows that if it's above 1, it's only a matter of time before you're, doubling in a heartbeat, and then we're off to the races.
And countries where that was allowed to spread rapidly led to death rates that were extremely high.
Right.
Just very high.
Northern Italy, New York initially.
Hundreds of times higher than in Australia. Yeah. And there were all sorts of other negative consequences like, breakdown of health services, economic dislocation through the self-lockdown thing. So I think I'm perfectly comfortable to say once the things spin out of control, you've got kind of costly outcomes on all dimensions that we don't want to go there.
Yeah, right. So if the R below 1 means that the virus is under control, that each person is, that the number of people who are infected is either stable or declining.
And you can bring R way below 1.
Yes.
In which case, you're welding the door shut, you're doing all this stuff. Or you can bring it more modestly below 1. Yeah. These are all choices.
And so what you're saying is that you need to take it as a given, essentially, that all of the possible universes that belong to the category R above 1
you just rule
are
those
inferior
out.
as a class
exactly.
than the entire class of experiences that are R less than 1.
Yes.
And therefore, you don't even really...
Well, that's my
consider
opinion.
those scenarios, right?
And then we say, okay, the tricky questions then become among the choices with R less than 1, which are worse than the others. And a good example is we could, and this is where you get to the kind of stupid stuff, right? So, someone is sitting on a park bench with no one else around, and you find them. For sitting on a park bench, right? It does nothing for R.
Right.
What does that do? What does that achieve exactly?
Right.
Right. So
the authoritarian group of people, I asked that same question and I would get that answer because I saw the police harassing a guy who was lying alone on a beach, who was sunbathing, right? Because he wasn't exercising. I was walking along the beach with my kids running about and exploring rock pools. That qualified as a legitimate activity because it was exercise. He was lying down. That's recreation. That wasn't permitted. Yeah. People at the time would say, you need to enforce compliance. It's a thin edge of the wedge. It's a slippery slope thing.
I'm not convinced by that, but okay. But all I would say is what is the marginal impact on spread of that measure versus its cost? And I think the cost-benefit ratio is pretty poor. Take another example. Should we close a school or should we close a bar? Okay.
Definitely the school. School sucks. Bars are fun.
But that's a question, right? You have to ask yourself, both of those reduce R by the same marginal amount, right? And so then you have to make a choice about which you think is more socially valuable.
Right.
That's where the conversation should have been. And I think within the space of R less than 1, governments across Australia made a whole bunch of decisions which didn't make a lot of sense.
Yes, and we can talk about those. But the problem is also that this decision that we're going to keep the R under 1 has to be made very early and very hard and very fast, right? Because I assume that you would not agree with the kinds of human rights violations and upending of our norms that would be needed to bring R under 1 if you've given the virus 8 months to rip. And
it's kind of
endemic
done
in the
then.
community.
No, it's done then.
This is sort of what the UK did, where like they initially were like, let's just let her rip. And then after everyone, after it was all over the place and uncontainable, they were like, oh shit, let's lock down. Well, by that stage, the lockdown is
exactly. And what's funny there is like the UK said, I mean, everyone remembers the framing, flatten the curve. Do you remember that? It was all about flatten the curve, right?
Yes.
This was in early March 2020. Flatten the curve, flatten the curve, flatten the curve. And then that went away, remember? We didn't talk about flatten the curve anymore.
Right.
Because that was like a failed strategy.
Right.
Flatten the curve was, we don't need R below 1.
I see.
We're just going to sort of do some measures to kind of prevent hospital systems from being overwhelmed, but we're not really going to solve this problem comprehensively.
We're just going to make the Hulk a little bit angry.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
We're not going to make him very angry.
Yeah.
No, once the genie's out of the bottle, it's out of the bottle.
You need to get it below 1.
We need to say something here, Stephen, about with the experience of Australia for people who weren't in Australia during the pandemic. There is a widely held perception that we endured lengthier and more intense lockdowns than elsewhere in the world.
Yes.
Even I have been in error in believing that Melbourne's lockdown was the longest in the world or something, or among the longest in the world.
Yeah.
Explain to people how the different states basically experienced the years of 2020 to 2022, the end of 2021.
First thing I would say is I'm not going to diminish someone's experience for being in a lockdown and all of the negative consequences it had. Like, that's real. We shouldn't pretend it's not real. And the government should be thinking about that as part of its, decision-making process. 2 things. Start with the UK, right? What you said before about flatten it. We were saying flatten the curve. That shows you that so there's self-lockdown, there's all these negative consequences. We also have to imagine what government's incentives are, or government's kind of constraints are, right? Which is, you might like the let it rip strategy, but no government's ever going to tolerate that. Like, at some point, the government's going to realize the consequences of that are so heavy that we're going to have to intervene and try and pull the brakes on. And
in terms of people's outrage about having loved ones dying and the hospitals overflowing,
the hospitals overflowing
that would come from people being furious about
like a lineup of ambulances at the hospital is just not tolerable. I mean, no government
for a prolonged period of time.
I mean, it's not, right? And in Australia, people who aren't in Australia ought to understand that Australia is a country that I would say among the countries of the world is one that values order quite highly.
Yes.
We don't like a lot of chaos.
We love a rule. Aussies love a rule.
Yeah. So we like impersonal authority. If somebody tells me what to do, can I swear on this?
Yeah.
Can I swear?
Yes, you can.
If someone tells me what to do, we say, get fucked, right? But if you write it on a sign.
That is a great distinction that I haven't heard before, Stephen, that I've never thought of, but you're putting your finger on something that I haven't quite been able to articulate, but it's so true. We do have this anti-authoritarian, rugged, individualistic ethos.
When it's coming out of someone's mouth.
When it's coming out of a human. Yeah,
if you just write the same words on a sign,
that's right. We'll obey the sign. Absolutely.
So I would, but in general, I think Australians like order. It's like we have a lot of controversy over the immigration program and the kind of, boat people, refugees, asylum seekers issue, and that's because people perceive chaos. They perceive
nobody likes disorder on that particular issue.
No, but I think on a lot
Trump
of issues.
And Brexit and Marine Le Pen and all of that.
Now, I think Australia as a country is just culturally, or in terms of our preferences in general, kind of disposed to want more order and more kind of, we don't want the chaos. So I think in Australia, governments had a pretty low threshold for what they were willing to tolerate on that.
Yeah.
And that kind of explains why so early in the process
they were able to get on board. But hang on, what I'm trying to get other people, non-Australians, to understand is actually how free and unlocked down
but
and
I wanted to
uninfected we were for a long time.
Understand that there is a background to why we did what we did and the way we did it that is specific to Australia to some degree.
Yeah.
The second thing to say is, look, the OECD publishes statistics on school closures they did a big exercise to collect from all the countries how many days of school people lost during COVID. So they measured all the way through to March 2021, how many school closures, how many days lost due to the COVID lockdowns there were. And I have to be honest, shocked when I looked this up for the book. But Melbourne's school closures were right on the OECD average.
Wait, March 2021's too early, to be fair, because it was the southern winter of 2021 that we had the huge Delta lockdowns.
That's the second part of the story.
Okay.
But let's just go with
in the initial year, the first year, 1 year in.
Right, which was a long way into
Yeah, but the critics of Australia's response say, well, yeah, that just means that you pushed back the reckoning. That everyone has to have the bill will fall due, and ours just fell due in the winter of 2021.
Let's put a pin in that for a second. Okay, so let's just look at the first year. Over the first year, Melbourne's days lost due to lockdowns of in-person instruction at school were like bang on the OECD average.
Right.
Sydney's were among the lowest in the OECD. Lower than the Netherlands, lower than Sweden, lower than Finland, like lower than almost everybody.
Right.
So there is a perception that Australia was locked down for the whole time.
And those are the two worst cities. I mean, if you were in Perth, for example, there was not a single day.
Or Brisbane, none.
Yeah.
I mean, we moved back to Australia during March 2020 because we thought we don't want to be in Washington when this is going down.
Yeah.
And my daughter, we were in Queensland, and she never missed a single week of in-person instruction for the entire pandemic. Right.
And just to clarify for people if they're wondering how it was possible, we closed the border completely, the external border, and nobody was allowed to come back in unless they spent 2 weeks in a quarantine hotel.
Exactly.
And then there was contact tracing and so on once people started moving around. But basically within 4 to 5 weeks of the of the outbreak and of locking the border, there was no COVID.
There was no
community spread of coronavirus.
It was by May. We basically had eliminated the virus.
Right.
And when I say eliminated, I mean 0 cases or low single-digit case numbers.
Yes.
Right. And
those case numbers were taking place in quarantine hotels and hospitals and things. They weren't taking place from someone wandering around and coughing on other people at a cafe.
And if there were local breakouts, we would isolate them, do contact tracing. And when cases are that low, you can do that stuff.
You can do and we had an army of people conducting contact tracing on behalf of the public health officials. Yes. Another thing that Americans probably wouldn't tolerate, scanning a QR code on your phone before entering every single place, so that then when you go and get your test and it turns out that you have it, the authorities can backtrack every single place that you've been to and contact all of the people who also checked in there within 1 hour of when you were there or whatever it is.
Yes.
So that being said, we basically experienced, most Australians in most places experienced a freer and certainly less chaotic and less stressful and less locked down pandemic than other countries, even before you start talking about the fact that it cost us less money and killed something like 90% fewer people per capita than the United States. Of course, per capita. I mean,
But the number is so small relative.
Yeah.
I mean, you tell, it's crazy. So now let me pick up on something you just said, which is really important. You said you got to look at after March 2021. Absolutely.
This brings me to the subject about which you are most furious in your book. Yes, I know where you're going here.
Most furious.
Bring it on.
I remember a mate said to me in December 2020, what are we doing about vaccines? They're vaccinating people in Britain. They're starting now. They're jabbing people, and it's December 2020. And I was thinking, what is happening? And so I started to kind of look into it, and it was kind of evident that by that time, to a significant degree, Australia had kind of missed the boat when it came to procuring sufficient quantities of a diverse portfolio of vaccines. And so other countries were rolling out vaccines. I mean, Israel had enough Pfizer vaccines for the entire population, and they were rolling them out en masse in like January 2021, right? It was like they were like the world leader. But even the US was like really ramping up very rapidly. Australia was 6 months behind, right?
And just to clarify for people, there was no domestic production capacity for mRNA vaccines. That's now being changed. We're developing that, and that should be online within the next 12 months or something, right, for the next pandemic.
Exactly.
But at the time, we were essentially reliant on imports, with the exception of one vaccine.
So we backed this UQ vaccine, so the University of Queensland vaccine, which was locally produced. And Australia has some significant kind of advantages in vaccine development, like Gardasil, which is the cervical cancer vaccine, which is, basically solved cervical cancer for all women in the world ever. It's like one of the best things that humanity has achieved in the last 20 years. That came from the University of Queensland, right? So there's reason to believe maybe we had some advantages to the kind of vaccine development. In the end, it didn't work, and it would give people false positive HIV test results, right? So it was like very quickly.
What did?
The UQ vaccine.
The UQ coronavirus vaccine.
Exactly. Okay. The vaccine that we had put as like a hope, like the locally developed one.
Right.
Very early, it never made it through the development process because of this issue.
Okay.
So then the backup was AstraZeneca, right, which was developed at Oxford University, and we could manufacture it in Melbourne with the facilities that we had.
I see.
At CSL. And so that was kind of it was really
so there was a sort of collaboration between, or under license, was it? From
exactly.
From
so
Oxford,
CSL licensed
University.
Exactly.
Licensed it out, make it here. And the government thought,
that'll be fine.
Yeah, we'll just do that.
That'll be fine. And so in addition, I think they ordered 5 million doses of Pfizer vaccine. And obviously Australia has a population of 25 million. So you need 50 million doses to double vax.
Right. So 5 million is only enough for 10% of the population.
It's like almost,
why bother?
Almost pointless, right? On the other hand, and this is important for people to understand, is in mid-2020, the US had this extraordinary thing, easily the best achievement of the Trump administration, called Operation Warp Speed, which recognized the challenge of the pandemic very early on. I mean, it was the first few months, which was there are like 8 candidate vaccines. We don't know which one's going to work. Let's just back them all, right? And we're going to give them money early.
I see. So Operation Warp Speed was throw a bunch of public money at all of the possible drugs and
build the factories.
Buy them all and
build the factories.
And we don't care what's going to work and what's
not. If it fails, whatever.
Right.
The point is that the Alex Tabarrok, I don't know if you know Alex, he writes for a blog called Marginal Revolution.
Oh, yes, of course.
He said the world's easiest cost-benefit analysis, because you're dealing with orders of magnitude.
Yes.
Right?
Literally.
The benefits are 10, 100, 1,000 times as high as the costs. In that world, you should be willing to...
Long story short, I don't want to dwell on Australia's vaccine screw-ups because they don't teach us a huge amount apart from, well, don't do that again. But basically, the Australian government was penny pinching and haggling and, there's all kinds of reports from inside Pfizer that they asked for a meeting with the health minister, Greg Hunt, in the middle of 2020. And it took, the government 7 weeks to get back to them or something. Right. And then the government sent a low-level, functionary in the department, which Pfizer considered to be a snub, and was haggling over money. And they were like, all right, well, we don't need to sell you our vaccines. We've got a bunch of other buyers that we can sell it to. Right. And at the same time, countries like Canada were buying up 5 or 6 times the amount that they needed. We should have just bought a shit ton and then...
all of them,
Yeah, and then if it worked, great, and if it didn't... And if we had too many, as
just
you
send
say
them
in the
to
book...
the Pacific.
Just hand them out to Samoa and Tonga and Fiji, and we look like great, like the good guys.
So I don't know why it happened, whether it's complacency or incompetence or whatever, but it happened. And as a result... you just look at the vaccine rollout curves of various countries, which we put in the book, and Australia was literally 6 months behind. If we had vaccinated like Israel, Delta never would have happened, or Delta never would have had the effect, the Delta wave, right, which precipitated this post-March 2021 wave of lockdowns in Australia.
And that all happened in sort of June, if I remember correctly.
If we had rolled out the vaccines in the first half of 2021, we would have just... been where we ended up being at the end of 2021,
right,
which was ready to open up. Our strategy was never to stay under the doona or under the...
That's a comforter, as Americans would say.
Forever.
Yeah.
It was, we are going to maintain this R less than 1 strategy so long as we aren't vaccinated. And when we're vaccinated, we're going to live our life again like this is the flu.
Yeah.
Because
Because
now
it
it
basically is if
Yeah.
you were vaccinated. Now, what do you say to people who say, well, that's all very well if you've been vaccinated within the past 2 months, so that makes sense. You know, you all get vaccinated, then you all catch it.
Right.
Whoop-de-doo. You don't get hospitalized and you don't die at the same rates. But what we were told when the vaccines were being rolled out was that there's a massive externality to not getting vaccinated, which is that you're going to kill grandma because the vaccines will stop you from transmitting the virus. And so as a collective problem, as like a public health question, we were sold a bill of goods. So goes the libertarian thinking on this, which was do your part and get vaccinated for other people. But it actually turns out that transmission was not really affected the way that we thought that it was going to be by vaccination.
Yeah, I would warn people, be careful how you interpret the numbers. Like, I know what you're saying. Be careful how you interpret the numbers. So when they do a study on vaccines, they look at like mortality. So how much does it affect your probability of death? That goes down by like 90%, right? I mean, it's hugely beneficial to you individually. And that early on, there was a suggestion that it also reduces the probability that you pass it to somebody else, right? And what you're saying is that probability ended up being a lot lower than we thought.
Well, I mean, I would go further than that and say that there were some people, and some people are misremembering that Fauci or the Australian government said this, which I don't think they did. But certainly Rachel Maddow said it on MSNBC, saying, if you get vaccinated, the virus stops with you. You can't pass it on.
Well, that's clearly
anymore.
not correct.
I mean, even at the time, I knew that wasn't correct because that's generally not how vaccines work. But there was an expectation. A lot of other vaccines for respiratory diseases, as I understand it, are better, like impede transmission better than the COVID vaccines.
Now, be careful. It does affect transmission at a social level. So, in other words, it is the case that you are less likely to get COVID if you have the vaccine, and therefore you are less likely to pass it on. You understand? So if you have COVID, if I get COVID for sure,
right,
and I'm vaccinated, I'm no less likely to pass it on, right?
I see.
But if I don't get it in the first place, I can't pass it on.
Right, but is it true that the vaccine makes you less likely to quote unquote get it if we're defining get it as just having the virus swarming around in your system?
Yes. I mean, you'll ingest the virus and it won't take off in your system, right? And become infectious. Right?
Yes, I see. I mean, this was always my common sense retort
to
the position that I've just articulated, which is that the easiest way that viruses get transmitted is by people sniffling and sneezing and coughing.
Yes.
And like touching their eyes and then touching other things and that sort of thing.
It depends whether you're talking about the transmission conditional on having the disease or the unconditional transmission probability. Unconditionally, it's lower. Of course it is, because you're not going to get the disease in the first place. So I think, anyway, the bottom line is there is definitely a social case for ensuring people have vaccination. We can argue about how strong that case is. We can argue about...
Well, let's argue about that because people are arguing about that. And at the next pandemic, this will be the locus of concern, right? So things like, let's just talk about vaccine mandates, for example. I think it's a pretty easy case to make that if you're a government-employed doctor, for example, working in a hospital during a pandemic, you have to be vaccinated because you're coming into contact with lots... Or if you're an aged care worker, right?
Yes.
But take the Canadian truckers, which is something that you hear a lot about, right? You know, should it be a requirement for a truck driver to be vaccinated in order to be able to do their job and make a living?
Right.
How do you, as an economist, measure the trade-offs of that?
Yeah, so the first thing is, obviously we're not going to pin someone down and force them to take a vaccine. So that's never going to happen, certainly in Australia. The question is but we have tools as a government to put penalties on people for not doing it, right? So we can incentivize it or we can punish.
Yeah, you can ruin their life by making it impossible to get a job, leave the country, enter a bar.
And to some degree we did that.
Yeah.
And there were a bunch of people in Australia who left their job because they didn't want to be vaccinated. And I think we have to think carefully about that, right? Now, I would say in Australia, we got to an extraordinarily high rate of vaccination, in excess of 90%, right? In Australia, we even delayed, right? 6 months later than we should have. But in the end, we got there. So I don't think Australia had a big issue in general with kind of vaccine skepticism, but we did have a lot of incentives to get to that.
Yeah, and
place.
for a long time afterwards, it
Yes.
was intolerable. I mean, you couldn't come into the country for ages. I mean, I think it was more than a year that you couldn't come
Yes.
back into Australia if you weren't, even after,
Yes.
the pandemic was well and truly over, and
Yes.
we were still saying that you had to have this slip of paper in order to come in.
And we do that with other vaccines. So children's immunizations in Australia are extremely highly incentivized to the point where if you don't get your kid a vaccination, you'll lose sort of government benefits, right?
Can't they not go to primary school?
Yeah, and that's true in the US. So where I am in the US, my daughters have to be vaccinated, and the school makes us prove it, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like vaccine mandates are a purely Australian thing. But I would say, well, we need to consider the social benefits and we need to consider the harm to people, right? And in my view, I mean, there's a philosophical question there, right? There's no kind of objectively correct answer to this question, which is, yeah, I don't care what people want to do. Let's force them to do it because it's what's in the interest of society. No, there's some costs we have to take into account, right? And I agree with you that if it turns out that the vaccine is not as socially beneficial in its prevention of spread, then that will mean maybe we want to temper some of those measures, right? And not be so hardline about it. And I think in the next pandemic, we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about some of these trade-offs, right, within the space of R less than one, about what we think is worthwhile and maybe what we didn't do right. So, again, I don't have a precise answer to the question, but I think that, again, like everything else, it's a cost-benefit analysis at a social level. What are we willing to tolerate as a people, and what is it costing us, and what do we get out of it? In my mind, looking back, I'm pretty comfortable with what we did with vaccinations, but I'm also like a pro-vax person.
Yeah, look, I mean, some people don't regard it as purely a cost-benefit analysis for the same reasons that some people are not just purely utilitarians, right?
Yes.
I mean, they think I'm sympathetic to this view, that there are human rights concerns. Like, if I could tell you that the cost-benefit analysis comes out in favor of me, like, taking you and locking you up in the Northern Territory in a concentration camp and depriving you of your freedom, but by making an example of you, it's going to increase compliance and then everybody else is going to be better off on net. It's just not good enough. We don't use cost-benefit analyses like that.
That's
true. You have fundamental human rights that can't be
But then we revert to the
abridged.
previous conversation, which is the person who you pass it on to also has rights. Right? And if because you're less likely to get it when you're vaccinated, you make it less likely for that other person to get it, well, those people have rights too, right? And so that's
they have a right if they're
not to be infected.
Not really. No, they have a right if they're hyper cautious about not catching a disease during a pandemic to stay away from people like you. But they don't have a right to force you to jump through hoops to keep their air crystal clear, clean and pure from diseases.
Do you know about the Coase theorem? Do you know about Coase?
No.
I don't know. In economics, Ronald Coase was a famous economist. He had this idea, the Coase theorem, which is in order for these exact situations where there are what we call, economists would call externalities, where one person is harming another or one person is benefiting another, we get these situations in economics where we don't get like an efficient outcome, right? So we see them a lot. Climate change, emissions, pollution, you have vaccines are a great example, right? Lots of examples where you're imposing costs on other people. Coase said, all you have to do, you don't have to regulate, you don't have to intervene. What you have to do is impose the property rights on one of the parties. In other words, the example I use in my class when I'm teaching it to my students is, you're at a concert. There's these people in front of you and they stand up. And you're the kind of person who doesn't like to stand up. You like to sit down at concerts. They stand up in front of you. You want to say to them, sit down, right? And you can say, well, they don't want to sit down, right? They're imposing an externality on you because you can't see. Well, if they had to sit down, you'd be imposing an externality on them because they can't stand. There's no God here to say who's right. You're both fighting over a finite resource, right? And we have to give it to one of you. And economists would say we need to impose the property rights. Pick one, have it be you have a right to see, or have it be they have a right to stand, and then let the two parties trade. Right. If I want them to sit down, I got to pay them. Mm-hmm. And if they want to dance, they have to pay me.
I see.
Right?
Yeah.
Either way, somebody has to have the right.
Yeah.
we're not going to make a moral judgment about who deserves the right, but we're going to make a judgment about who has it and then let the market work, right?
Got it.
So the idea behind vaccines is to say, well, we have to kind of pick, right? Who has the right? Do you have the right to be free from infection, or does someone have a right not to take a vaccine? But whichever way we go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's messy because you being vaccinated doesn't mean that I don't get infected. It just makes it less likely.
There could be a situation where you're a person and you go to the shops and you literally breathe in the thing that they caused you to get the disease, right?
Yes.
So I don't know if I think it's hard to say one person is right or wrong.
So, I mean,
we just need to come up with a situation where the good outcome happens.
Right.
So one idea, and this is what we talk about in the book, I mean, there's vaccine mandates, but there's also incentives. So we can, like Coase would say, you just tax the thing. That's why we want carbon taxes, because we just want the people who are emitting carbon to take into account the costs they're imposing.
I mean, we did tax the thing, just not financially, right?
No,
we taxed people in the form of saying
we could come up with a number for like the socially optimal, the social benefit of a vaccine, and we could have paid people.
Right.
We could have paid them to take the vaccine, right? We chose a different path, which was to impose the property rights and then penalize people. Like, in other words, you have an obligation to get the vaccine.
Yeah, right.
And if you don't do this...
But you could flip it and you could give benefits.
Exactly.
Instead of banning the unvaccinated from going on holidays, you could give a free international holiday to everyone who gets vaccinated.
I mean, there's a number. It's not infinite. But, and I would say the current government, the former opposition, actually proposed to pay people. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
As the opposition, they said, let's pay people to vaccinate. And it's like the most economically sensible thing I can remember.
Although you make another point as an economist in the book, which is that actually there's this behavioral economics that comes into this, which is that once you start coding an act in people's mind as being doing it for the money, it actually reduces compliance probably, because we're more motivated by our own sense of duty and feeling good about ourselves than we are by a couple of $100.
But at the margin, if you want more vaccination, you can incentivize it.
Yeah, right.
We don't have to use sticks.
Let me just get to another thing where there's this kind of tricky trade-off about externalities, which is essentially locking people up, right? So quarantine. I think the idea of locking people up who are choosing to be locked up because they want to come into the country is perfectly legitimate. But there were cases of, outback communities where people couldn't self-isolate or were unwilling to self-isolate, especially in Indigenous communities.
Right.
And so the police would come and they would take people and put them into quarantine camps for 2 weeks against their will. Right. You're essentially incarcerating innocent people who refuse to abide by a stay-at-home order.
Yes.
In the interests of a public health rule.
Yes.
Similarly, you couldn't leave the country.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
My colleagues were like, where are you?
When there was a particularly nasty Delta outbreak in India, there were a lot of Australians living in India and they couldn't come back to Australia at all. There was a ban on Australians returning from India. At the same time, because of the quarantine hotel capacity being limited, the government would just summarily issue to airlines the number of passengers that they're allowed to bring into the country on any given day, and the airlines would bump 95% of all the passengers on each flight, except for the 5% most lucrative ones. So people like my brother trying to come back from the UK would have to basically remortgage their house to spend $30,000 on business class, full fare business class tickets for their family to come back so that they wouldn't get bumped. So these are all extreme impositions on the movement and freedom of people in the interests of, I suppose, keeping R under one. At what point does one start rethinking them and going, well, that would be too much? Right.
So let me tell you, the Indian thing is the single worst thing, I think, in the pandemic. We don't talk about it in the book, I would say, and there was only so many things we could talk about. We allude to it in one place, and we said that it's something that shouldn't happen, right? There are certain, I live in the US, there are certain inalienable rights that people have, and I believe, there are certainly things that are beyond this cost-benefit ratio question, right? Which is there is something that, like, if you're an Australian and you want to come into the country, you should have the right to do that.
Yeah, if you're a citizen, it's your country. It belongs to you.
That's literally, it's your endowment. You are Australian, right? Yes. So that's a good example of something that I think the fact that we literally would not permit Australians to enter the country from that, I think is deeply immoral, right? And I think that's a situation where you say, whatever R is, who cares? We're not going to do that, right? But I would say, so there are some situations like that, and we can point to lots of them. Again, like the crazy way we dealt with certain people doing things that were totally benign, and we treated them very harshly as a result.
Like what?
Well, just the whole thing we're saying, like...
Yeah, like the Northern Territory.
Yeah, or like some kid in a park, or like whatever.
Right.
I mean,
or someone posts on Facebook about how they want to organise a protest rally and the police come over.
So we have a lot of we need to have a lot of reflection about what we did and how beneficial it was, and maybe whether it crossed some lines. But here's what I would say: a lot of these issues can be solved with more competent management by governments, right? So we stuck with hotel quarantine for the whole time. We literally put infected people into hotels. And a hotel is not an environment that is well designed to like contain a virus. Every breakout in Australia happened because of a leak in hotel quarantine in some way or another, right?
I mean, hotels are ordinary buildings built usually right in the middle of the busiest
with lots of ventilation.
Lots of
city. It's like a cruise ship, but not on the water, right? And so the fact that we didn't very early on in the pandemic go, actually, let's just build some damn hotel quarantine facilities, temporary buildings, like make them cheap, make them whatever. Let's do it. Let's actually build that capacity.
There was that conversation. I remember arguing for it on the air on my radio show. But there was also, again, a libertarian, I don't even want to call it libertarian. There was I think, not unreasonable concern that the government shouldn't be in the business of building concentration camps for its citizens, even really nice ones.
I don't know. I would just say if we had sufficient hotel quarantine capacity that it was effective, we wouldn't have needed to deny entry to the people who were in India. You know what I mean?
Like, so there are trade-offs. I mean, I think we should probably just build a whole bunch of quarantine facilities on the outskirts of the big cities because we know there will be another big pandemic and we may need it, and hopefully we don't need it. But it's one of those things where if you get to the position at which you do need it, you want to have made the decisions now that you don't want to have not made.
Absolutely. It's good insurance.
It's good insurance policy. Right? It's like the vaccines.
Yeah. So I would just say, look, there are some things that clearly we did badly, and there are some things that clearly overstepped the line, but we also ought to think, were there alternatives which would have generated the same outcome at much lower cost? And I think that's...
And I guess the point of your book is really just to clarify, because the economics and the health outcomes both flourish when R is less than 1. The whole conversation should just be, is this the optimal tool to achieve R less than 1 with the fewest externalities?
Yes.
And if you do that, then you can say, okay, well, hotel quarantine isn't great because you have to lock so many more Australians out. It makes it harder for them to get home. And then you had the whole lockdowns, which only came about because of hotel quarantine, which could have been avoided. We could have all been cavorting on the beach for a full 2 years.
Yes. And we didn't have, I think we didn't have enough conversations that were framed in that way. Like, I think if people understood, because the thing we haven't talked about at all, and I think this is really important, is this whole thing, all of these measures being effective. Like, okay, let's put it this way. You can evade as many taxes as you like, right? The government will audit you, and there's some chance that you'll be caught, but you could get away with it, right? Most people don't do that. Do you think they do that because they're worried about being audited? Some people, but a lot of people do the right thing because they feel like it's the right thing to do, right? I mean, you could walk out into the street and kill someone. Do you not kill someone because you're worried you might go to jail? I mean, maybe it's just you don't want to kill someone.
Well, I don't want to kill someone, but I do want to cheat on my taxes. Does that make me a bad person?
But so much of society functions on voluntary action. Like our willingness to just go with the flow, right? To do the right thing, right? Australia went along with a lot of this stuff, but we really pushed them to their limit. And I think there's a significant degree to which if things had gone further, I think we would have lost people, right? And I think many cases,
By
government...
lost people, you mean the community wouldn't have stood for it.
They just wouldn't have gone along with it any
Yeah,
longer.
yeah,
And I
right.
think the reason we lifted restrictions when we did, in the way we did them, was because I think politicians realised that people
Yeah.
weren't going to cop it anymore.
Especially the New South Wales Premier and the Prime Minister.
Right? They just said...
They were
and they,
like,
I
it's
think...
going to happen. We've just got to...
Because you have to have
this.
people, you have to have public support. And I think in the thing we need to think about is in the next, if there's another pandemic, which,
Not if.
it's a highly likely.
Not if.
No, we say when in the book, right? It's a highly likely scenario. I think people will be a lot less willing to go along with it because they'll remember what happened last time. And so I think we need to, and this is part of why we wrote the book, we need to do some hard thinking about what we did well and what we didn't do well so that we just do a much better job next time, because I'm not sure we're going to automatically have the buy-in that we had.
Stephen, thank you for the book. It's a fabulous read. I highly recommend it. Thank you for your time.
Cheers, man.